Hi, everybody. My name is James Boston. I'm the founder of the Association of Former British Colonies. The association's mission is to examine the legacies of British colonisation with a view to informing UK and global policy change around reparations and decolonisation. During today's interview, we're going to focus on the Turks and Caicos Islands and consider the impacts and legacies of British colonisations within the specific British overseas territories. To assist with doing this today, I'm joined by Akierra Missick. I'd like to hand over to you, and if you could introduce yourself to our listeners, please.
Hi, thank you so much, James, and thank you for everyone who's tuned in today. My name is Akierra Missick. I am a member of parliament for the amazing constituency of Leeward and Long Bay here in Providenciales, Turks and Caicos Islands. And my other career, I'm an attorney at law with a specialization in dispute resolution and employment matters. And so I'm very excited to have this conversation with James so that I can introduce my little piece of paradise to the rest of the world. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much for joining us. So, as always with our interviews, we're going to start with some history. And so, almost, I'd like to kind of pretend that our listeners know absolutely nothing about the Turks and Caicos Islands. So, in delving into the historical context, could you provide an overview of how British colonisation has impacted the history and societal fabric of the Turks and Caicos Islands?
Well, I'd be happy to. So, the Turks and Caicos Islands is a chain of islands in the northern Atlantic Sea, not too far from the United States. We are still a British territory. I think it was in the 1980s, well, not even, it was in the early 2000s. The phrase turned from British colony to British overseas territory. So, in that essence, we are British citizens, but have an opportunity to live here in paradise. We have had various persons settle our islands. Britain was the final successor. There were wars between Britain and Spain. There was a moment where we were under the administrative control of Jamaica when they were a colony of Britain, as well as the Bahamas. In 1974, our islands became self sufficient and autonomous and designated as a British colony as the Bahamas, Jamaica, and other Caribbean countries fought for their independence from Britain. And as a result of them succeeding in their independence fight, we were left behind as a little brother or sister was left behind with mom and dad. And so we are still British today.
Thank you. And just a quick question, something you said interested me. You mentioned the transition from being labeled as a colony to a territory. Could you explain the reasoning behind that?
I think during that time in the early 2000s, when there was a review, and I think it was a white paper or green paper that was pushed in the United Kingdom Parliament, so more than likely it's the House of Commons, where the legislation sought to distance themselves from the idea of the colony to more of the territory, which is kind of what the United States does when they speak about Guam and Puerto Rico and the US Virgin Islands. And so that shift in terminology there then brought an immigration shift for us. And all Turks and Caicos Islanders, as we call ourselves locally, if you were at the time in 2002 when the shift happened, a British colony subject or a subject at that time, you were entitled to also obtain your full British citizenship. And anyone who then became naturalized would be deemed a British overseas territory citizen throughout the 13 territories that the United Kingdom still has control over.
Thank you very much for clarifying that. And going back to our history again, so in what ways did British colonization impact the economic and also the governmental aspects of the Turks and Caicos Islands?
Well, we adopt the Westminster system. So, in terms of governance, our direct influence that we could find from Britain would be our political system, where it's first past the post, whoever has the majority in the House then gets to form the government. And so you have the legislative system, and then you have the executive. Where we're a little different than the United Kingdom is that their head of state actually is not involved in the decision making at the executive level. So that would be His Majesty King Charles, etc. Whereas in the Turks and Caicos Islands, his representative, which is titled a governor, is actually the leader, the president of the executive, and the premier, who in England would be the prime minister, would then be a member of the cabinet. And so that is a direct influence that we could see here in terms of our governance and our democracy sort of makeup in these islands. In terms of economic benefit, it was in the late 70s, early 80s that the United Kingdom, for whatever reason, took the decision that their territories would be able to have tax advantage status in the world. And so they created a mechanism that would provide the creation of the financial services industry, the incorporation of companies, the ability to bank overseas that would be able to have tax deferred positions from the United Kingdom, the creation of other citizenship that would stop your tax payments on your capital gains or income tax in the United Kingdom. And so they created this sort of tax haven concept for their territories as a mechanism to stop having to fund so many of the infrastructure needs or the economic needs or the societal needs that the territories would have, given the fact that the territories are all still under 100,000 in population, but still have the same demands that large countries would have and meeting the needs of their people. And you could see in our infrastructure and our capital, there is an element of British and Bermudan infrastructure. But because Turks and Caicos is still very young in terms of the Caribbean region's development and our tourism product, we do reflect parts of the United States tourism product. So it's there. We can feel it. We're British. We have a British flag. We have a British governor. Our passports say we're British citizens or British overseas territory citizens. But the actual connection between the two countries is still miles away from where it may have been with some of the independent and decolonized countries that Britain once managed.
Thank you. It's very interesting you talk about the kind of governmental aspects. I mean, this is something that you seem to see across most former British colonies, not just in the Caribbean region, but even as far as Asia. You see kind of British influence in the legal system, the parliamentary system, the education system still to this day. And I suppose an interesting question is one around decolonisation, a word you've just used, and whether it's time for former British colonies and British overseas territories to move away from that. Is an interesting question at the moment.
Yes.
Just to kind of dig a bit deeper in terms of the economics. So can you explain how Britain was able to benefit from exploitative colonial practices? So we're aware that in the Caribbean, chattel slavery was something that Britain significantly financially benefited from. Was that a similar case in the Turks and Caicos Islands as well?
No. So our islands are so flat. We can't grow anything. The best thing about these islands is the natural beauty that God has given us, sun, sand, and sea, and the proximity to the United States. So tourism is the number one industry because it's so convenient to get here. Our currency is the US dollar, an agreement that was made between the United Kingdom and the United States, given our proximity to trade with the United States. Having to convert from pounds would have been something that would have eaten away at the economic benefits. Other matters that are similar with the United Kingdom and us is we drive on the same side of the road as you do over there. We have an English legal system because we're still a territory at the end of the day. So our highest court would be the Privy Council. And so that is a body that sits in London, made up of British judges or that are selected from the House of Lords pool of judges. And so when we study subjects like law, I'm British trained, British educated, because the system is, albeit the same. When I have case law that I'm challenging in court, they tend to be British case law. With the Caribbean region, although is through their CCJ, the Caribbean Court of Justice, they are now creating a database that Turks and Caicos, Cayman Islands, BVI are considering using in terms of the case law decisions that are being made, because in the West Indies, in the Caribbean, we are more alike than we are with the United Kingdom, albeit the influence of the United Kingdom is still very prevalent in the islands, despite it being not so much the way we speak, the way we work, the way we talk. And the cultural for the food, but the idea of the education being superior than what is here.
Mm.
The idea that there's better opportunities for Turks and Caicos Islanders to work and live in the United Kingdom. And so that's something that we have to fight against in the Turks and Caicos Islands, to encourage the generations behind me to return to these islands and give their skills and gifts to the building of the Turks and Caicos Islands, and not just becoming another number in the United Kingdom.
That's really interesting. So just to kind of delve into something you said earlier, so you mentioned that chattel slavery wasn't really something that took place at all, or on a large scale in Turks and Caicos Islands. And the second part of my question was, does it kind of make it a kind of an anomaly in comparison to other Caribbean islands where chattel slavery was very much commonplace, unfortunately?
It is an anomaly. So there would have been some form of chattel slavery. Now, it
Okay.
would have been with the Americans, because when there was an attempt to grow tobacco in these islands, there were two American plantations. And so they would have been worked by persons brought to the island, as well as whomever they found here, which should have been the Lucayan Indians, would
Mm.
have been the inhabitants of the territory prior to the arrival of the visitors, who decided that this was an amazing place for them to do whatever it was that they came to do. So, in that instance, if Britain did have some influence, it was very minimal, because it would have been more from the United States.
And was that before or after American independence from Britain? So what at that time were those kind of Americans who were engaging in chattel slavery, shall we say, in the Turks Chaos? Were they doing that as kind of as a British colony or as an independent nation?
They were independent then.
They were independent then.
Yep.
Okay.
So
So,
there really was no draw for anyone to stop in these islands, apart
mm,
from the fact that if it was bad weather or they washed ashore. Because in the instance when they would have arrived here, they would have just seen flat land where
sure.
nothing grows. And so when we did have slaves or enslaved persons arrive in the islands, the history shows that that was due to shipwrecks and persons swimming to shore. So we had a shipwreck, the Bombara shipwreck, that wrecked in the island of Middle Caicos here in Turks and Caicos, and there's history and artifacts of that. There's some history and artifacts in our museum that indicates Christopher Columbus actually landed in the Turks and Caicos and not San Salvador, as is recorded in the history of rewriting the Christopher Columbus story. And so we actually have this deep water passage called the Columbus Passage, where ships
Mm,
pass through to get over to the trade to elsewhere in the world that actually exists today. And so, if there, not if, those that were enslaved at that time, it wasn't done on a large scale. It was
right.
mainly, we're shipwrecked, we're stuck here. We need to figure out how we're going to live here until we could leave.
Right. Okay. That's very interesting. Very interesting. Okay. A word on the indigenous populations of the Turks and Caicos. You mentioned that there were an indigenous population.
Yeah.
What happened to them?
Same thing that happened to all the others. Die out, integrated. I mean, we have persons who live here today where you can see that they would have the traditional Lucayan look to them, but
Okay.
generations down the line, they would have completely filtered out. We also had two American bases here, and this would have been in the 70s and the 80s as well. So the Americans and Britain had an agreement that the Americans can set up a base. And so there is interracial mix that can
Mm.
be seen on the islands as well.
Okay. Thank you.
Mm.
Okay. So I want to move on to the next section, which is around conversation on reparations and decolonisation. And so my first question is, how do you perceive the contemporary ramifications of British colonisation in the Turks and Caicos Islands? And to what extent do these legacies persist today?
Well, the legacies persist because we're still a territory.
Yeah.
And so, as long as someone is holding on to a country that they can influence by providing an executive head of their choosing to
Mm.
manage and oversee an elected government of people, then we're not free in that
Right.
instance. And so, decolonization would be something that we need to have a serious conversation in these islands and move beyond the concept and really decide how we're going to move forward with it. Now, in discussions with the United Kingdom, they've advised that the moment we say we're ready for independence, then they will relinquish their responsibility. But that does not come with them assisting with developing the necessary infrastructure for independence. And it almost feels as if, well, we're not going to help you. So if you go out on your own, you'll figure it out. I believe we can figure it out. And we
Mm.
have done so for the last 40 plus years that we've had representative politics and democracy in these islands. But I do believe that there's an obligation on the United Kingdom to ensure that the necessary infrastructure, not just physical infrastructure, but social infrastructure is in place to allow us as a people to move forward. So, our position would be that the reparations we would seek would not be because of past wrongs. What we would be seeking is future assistance in building a country that's ready to self govern, self regulate, and provide the societal and economic benefits that are required in order to be a successful country. We don't want to be a country that regresses because we're having the conversation of becoming independent or decolonizing our status in the world. We want to be able to excel on the heels of that next phase. And so the conversation that's happening in the region, I'm well aware of, having attended lectures by the University of the West Indies,
Mm.
by listening into CARICOM discussions, reading an article. I think it was one of the senior MPs in Jamaica who kind of brought it again to the forefront. So I'm aware of the discussions that are happening. But from a Turks and Caicos standpoint, I would want Britain to honor what needs to be done in order to have a successful Turks and Caicos post them versus saying, well, we did this in the past. Here's what we can do as a sum of money for you to figure it out. And so I would like our conversation to be a little bit different.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And then considering questions around independence, what pathways would you propose for advancing calls and momentum to achieve independence?
Well, first, for us here, and be real frank, there's only 12,000 voters. And
Mm-hmm.
so a decision on independence will rest on their shoulders.
Right.
And there's that element of fear of the unknown that seems to still be prevalent in the islands, and the different generations are treating that fear differently. The younger ones are like, let's do it, let's just try it. The older ones are saying, oh, but I remember a time where we couldn't feed ourselves and we had to wait for the boat from England to come and we had to wait for that. And so it's just kind of talking through that level of fear. So I think some of the catalysts that could happen is having better discussions with our Caribbean neighbors who have gone independent and look at the perks that they were able to achieve and ascertain from that walk, and also look at some of the downsides and the consequences that they suffered from as well, and then chart the course together with a unified voice. What is happening here in the islands is that every so often independence becomes a political hot potato. And
Mm.
so one party would say, this is what we're going to do. And the next party would say, well, we don't support that. And then it flips. The party that didn't support it now supports it. And the one that did support it doesn't. And so it's just this silly, silly political hot potato. And the level of political maturity in the Turks and Caicos Islands has grown, but we still have a few more steps to go in understanding that it's about the policies and the people, and not the people who are trying to bring the policies forward.
So just to kind of dig a bit deeper, so both myself and the audience can understand the mechanisms behind independence. I'm assuming there would have to be a referendum, a vote of some kind, so that the 12,000 individuals you mentioned could vote and have their say. Is that something Britain or the British government would have to agree to, however?
At the moment, yes, they would have to agree to it. Our Constitution does not provide for such a mechanism. Our Constitution actually provides no referendum provisions in it. Currently, well, almost a year now, we had a roundtable discussion with the Foreign and Commonwealth Development Office and the head of the office, I think James Cleavery or something like that. I'm sorry if I'm butchering James's name, but he's the head. And so he came down with his team. We met as members of parliament with our legal team, and we walked through our current constitution with senior counsel Sir Jeffrey Giles KC, who is known to assist Cayman Islands in their exercise a few years ago. And one of the requests that we have asked for is a referendum provision in our constitution with one around the concept of independence. So, as of today, if we wanted to have a referendum on independence, we would need permission from the Secretary of State in the United Kingdom to do so. But once we're able to have our Constitution amended and the provisions of it would then be in the Constitution, we wouldn't need that consent then.
Okay. And have the British government shown any inclination to engage in the conversation around independence for the Turks and Caicos Islands?
Well, like I said, they do the kind of throwaway sentence where if you want it, let us know, you'll get it. We're I think they said something like 9 months as well would be the full process for it. So that's just saying, okay, go, versus here's what we're going to do to assist in making sure you are ready for this next step. And so those conversations really need to be had. But currently, the current administration, which I'm a member of, is split. Literally, we are split 50-50 on independence. And so the conversation has not been able to advance any further because as a political organization, we are not settled in our mind on where we want to go, whether it's independence or not.
Really interesting. And I want to touch on something that we kind of mentioned earlier in the kind of relation to CARICOM. So obviously CARICOM have a clear reparations mandate. What's the Turks and Caicos Islands stance on the CARICOM reparations mandate? Is that something that they're fully supportive of and feel very much a part of? Or do they have a slightly different view on reparations and what it might look like?
Well, I'm not sure what our stance is because we haven't seen any releases supporting it or not supporting it from the government. The CARICOM position is we are associated members, so we're not full members because we're territories. So Cayman Islands, ourselves, Bermuda, we are just associate members. And when the member states make significant sort of decisions, we sometimes are not consulted, nor are we invited to vote in because as associate members, we're not voters at the end of the day in a CARICOM setting. So we get invited to the meetings, the discussions, but when it comes down to it, you would have the CARICOM leads and full members kind of make final decisions. So in terms of their position on reparations and how it will affect the Turks and Caicos Islands, I'm not clear on that because we have had no communique from our administration advising that we have signed on to also join in the discussion and or the demand and requests that is being made by CARICOM.
And do you think that there are steps that CARICOM could take to support the Turks and Caicos Islands should you become an independent nation?
Yes, I would hope so. And I think in the process, I think what I would desire us to do in that process is have the full and frank discussion about the pros and cons of independence and what our neighbors had experienced during their process. Because what would help us is it's already been done. And so we can study it and we could make a concrete decision that this is the best interest for the people of these islands. Whereas when our CARICOM brothers and sisters went for their independence in the 60s and the 70s, and I think St. Kitts might have been late 80s even, which may have been the last Caribbean country that sought independence, we have an opportunity to review their process, review their history,
Mm.
and make the best decisions. So I think Turks and Caicos is in a better place than where they were when they considered independence and fought for independence, as some of them say. And I think we are in a better position to do the research and make a sound, reasonable decision for our future.
Thank you. That's really interesting. And just to go on to talking about decolonization of kind of structures within the Turks and Caicos Islands, do you think that there are any colonial era laws, for example, or structures within society that are in need of decolonization?
Not really. And the reason why I say that is even though we are still a territory, and so British law that's made there can impact us if there's an order in council to bring it forward. But we do have the ability, and we have done from, I think the earliest piece of localized legislation may be from 1950s. And so governments of the current time, the modern time, have had opportunities to go and amend previous legislation that may have been sent down and just incorporated into our structures. And recently we did that just last week, where we had significant amendments to the notary public ordinance, which actually started in 1853. And so we've now brought in brand new legislation and repealed the 1853 legislation. So there is an opportunity for modern legislation to remove previous legislation that may not fit within our society today.
And in terms of the education system, do you feel like that's in reform? And just to kind of add some additional context, something that I've observed happening across different former British colonies, even places like Australia, for example, in regions in South Asia, there have been efforts to reconfigure the education system that was left from Britain during the colonial times, so that it is more diverse, more reflective of kind of present day communities, for example. It doesn't have a kind of Eurocentric bias, but actually incorporates knowledge systems from kind of represented communities that are kind of local, but also from different parts of the world. Do you think there's a kind of need for educational reform in the Turks and Caicos Islands as well?
Yes, and when I was the Minister of Education, the reform that I sought to have led is a child centered learning approach. So
Mm,
instead of the historic way that we were taught and had the Eurocentric element to our education system, the concept that I wanted to bring forward was teach the basics, how to read, how to compute regular math, but then see how a child learns, which gives the child the opportunity to excel in their learning style and show their interest in areas earlier than what the system provides us to show an interest in, which comes normally at secondary school. And
mhm.
so that was kind of radical. I did get a lot of abuse, not physical abuse, but concern that I was taking us too far away from the traditional educational system. And so unfortunately, it didn't pass the final test because once my administration was not returned to government, the new administration literally drew a line through it and went back to the tradition. And so again, it's about having the conversations of what is traditional from what is modern and how we can benefit from new teaching techniques and new subject area learning
Mm.
as well. So our system here is very unique where it's Caribbean based, but the Caribbean based system is based on Britain and the Eurocentric element. So you still would get sort of the the idea of the United Kingdom sort of culture melded into the Caribbean, passed over and on to the Turks and Caicos Islands. So I do think there is always scope for reform in
Mm.
education, but the reform should really be not what the subject matter is, but how does the child learn and what is the child interested in. Instead of
Okay,
building robots, we should be able to build creative thinkers through education. And that's my biggest take from it that needs to be
thanks.
pushed forward.
Thanks, and that's some really interesting ideas that I think definitely would be worth further discussion in this area. My final few questions, and this one is quite a short, concise question.
Okay.
In your opinion, is independence for the Turks and Caicos Islands necessary? And if so, why?
I believe it's necessary, but I'm pro independence. And the reason why is it's time for us to stand and develop our country the way that we want to do so without having to have an overseer or a shadow hanging over us. The
Mm.
Turks and Caicos has had its constitution suspended twice by Britain, which reverted us to direct control from Westminster. And in this modern age, that happened in 2009. I mean, it was just, I was flabbergasted to be a resident in a country that was being ran and operated 4,000 miles away. And to know that that could happen at any time, our brothers and sisters in BVI, I know you said the question was concise. I'm sorry. Our brothers and sisters in BVI are experiencing a similar sort of matter that's happening with the threat of the suspension of their constitution. I don't like having to operate under threats. And so that's why I think independence is important. We should be able to make the decisions that we need to make, deal with the consequences that we need to deal with, and not have someone threaten to pull our constitution and silence the elected opportunity of the people of the islands.
And just a caveat question: what was the reason behind the suspension in 2009?
Widespread corruption was the allegation.
Right.
And so the trials for the first group of persons who were politicians concluded with two not guilties.
Mm.
So where was the whole corruption thing, England? After it cost us $180 million to get to a not guilty, and then two were found guilty and sentenced to 6 months in a year imprisonment. So how does that reflect widespread corruption and abuse in public service?
Mm.
But alas, 2008, and we're still dealing with this today. So 4 years from now, if this is still a thing, this would have been a 20-year trial.
Interesting. And my final question, reflecting on your own experiences and expertise, how can individuals, organizations, and governments contribute to fostering a more comprehensive understanding of the impacts of British colonization and the need for independence in the Turks and Caicos Islands?
By forums like this, having these sorts of discussions, joining wider forums of discussions, actually putting pen to paper and saying, James, how can your organization assist me with this portion and concern about independence? Or other organizations, how can CARICOM work closer with your organization that is in the United Kingdom that has persons coming and saying, listen, what has happened in the past is wrong and this needs to be repaired, and getting those voices heard and pushing at the doors and finding the friendly MPs in the United Kingdom that's prepared to stand in their opportunity and advance these causes. And so a lot of work needs to be done, but it needs to just an open mind and start with a conversation. This is a spark. Let's see how we keep the fire burning.
Thank you very much. It's been a very insightful interview. And would you like to leave our guests or our listeners, should I say, with any resources, any recommended material that you would suggest people could read to learn more about what we've discussed today?
Well, if you just want to learn about the Turks and Caicos, you could just Google that, and the first thing that will pop up will probably be our Ministry of Tourism website. But in terms of resources and learning, we actually don't have any on this subject. And so by using this sort of discussion and other forums, we're bringing it together, and we just need to get it, the idea of it really percolating in the islands, because once the idea is percolated, you will see the fruits of that labor.
Thank you very much. Very much food for thought. We'll leave the interview there, but thank you everybody for listening. You can find this interview, and you can also find small clips from this interview uploaded on the Association of Former British Colonies social media channels. You can contact me myself on Instagram, Facebook, or on the Association of Former British Colonies social media pages with any questions you have for myself or for Akierra as well. Thank you.
Thank you. Take care.